ADX Florence, where America's worst criminals disappear. Imagine a prison where inmates are locked alone for 23 hours a day. No yard filled with shouting voices. No cellmate. No chance of escape. Just silence. Concrete walls. And the feeling that you've been erased from the world. This is ADX Florence, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Inside these walls live America's most feared criminals, terrorists, cartel leaders, mob bosses, and mass killers. People who once controlled empires, now reduced to shadows behind steel doors. But here's the most shocking part. Inmates at ADX Florence don't just serve time. They disappear. Cut off from the outside world. Some spend decades without a single human touch. It's a place designed not only to punish, but to erase. And tonight, you'll see exactly how. But how does a prison make human beings disappear without ever killing them? That's where our story begins. Built to break the human mind. ADX Florence opened in 1994, deep in the mountains of Colorado. From the outside, it looks like a fortress, high fences, armed towers, razor wire glistening under the sun. But the real power of this place isn't what you see on the outside. It's what happens once those doors slam shut. Cells are built from thick concrete. The windows are so small that inmates can't even see the horizon. They call them slit windows, because the only thing visible is the sky. No mountains. No ground. No freedom. Every meal is passed through a slot. Every move is controlled. Even showers are inside the cell, so prisoners don't step out except for 1 hour a day. And even that hour is spent in a small, empty cage, barely bigger than a walk-in closet. This is the clean version of solitary confinement. No filth, no chaos like in Rikers or Attica. But that's exactly what makes it terrifying. Here, punishment is silence. And silence breaks the mind. Some inmates beg for guards to talk to them. Others scream into the walls until their voices go raw. Over time, many lose track of days, of weeks, of years. They become ghosts. And then, just when you think you know how bad it is, an extreme event hits. One prisoner, desperate to escape his invisible cage, tries to slash his own wrists with a piece of sharpened plastic. The guards rush in, alarms blaring, and drag him out before the blood can finish his plan. The message spreads through the unit. This is a place where your body may live, but your spirit doesn't survive. Famous faces, invisible lives. The blood on the concrete floor told every inmate one truth. ADX Florence is a place where desperation rules. But the man dragged out that night wasn't the only one slowly disappearing. Behind the steel doors were names the world once feared. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, the domestic terrorist who mailed bombs across America. Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind behind the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. El Chapo Guzman, the cartel king who once tunneled his way out of a maximum security prison in Mexico. Here, they all looked the same, gray jumpsuits, locked doors, and silence. Day after day, the routine never changed. Guards pushed food through slots. Inmates ate alone. A flickering fluorescent light above the bed buzzed endlessly. The only thing breaking the silence was the occasional clank of steel when a door opened. But it wasn't always calm. The silence sometimes cracked. One guard once said, "You don't hear riots here, you hear echoes." And then came another extreme moment. A prisoner, unable to take the silence anymore, smashed his head repeatedly against the concrete wall. Blood smeared across the cell as he screamed until his voice gave out. By the time officers rushed in, the man was barely conscious. His body still alive, but his mind already gone. That night, the other inmates didn't need to see it. The sound alone reminded them, at ADX Florence, madness is always waiting behind the door. A prison built for control. The sound of skull hitting concrete haunted the unit for days. Some inmates tried to block it out. Others whispered through vents, asking if the man had survived. But in ADX Florence, answers rarely came. Silence swallowed everything. The prison was built for control, absolute, unbreakable control. Guards never walked alone. Doors opened only when the last one had closed. Cameras watched every hallway, every movement. Even the yard time, just 1 hour a day, was designed like a trap. Prisoners were led, one by one, into what looked like an empty cage with high walls. From inside, they could only see a sliver of the sky above. For some, that hour was their only reminder the outside world still existed. One inmate once said, "I stared at that piece of sky until my eyes burned. It was all I had." But even with that tiny freedom, violence still found its way in. One day, during the short walk to the recreation cages, an inmate lashed out at a correctional officer. With a sharpened piece of metal hidden in his waistband, he slashed across the guard's arm. Sirens exploded, boots thundered down the hall, and within seconds, the prisoner was slammed face-first onto the ground. Blood dripped onto the cold floor. The guard survived, but the message spread fast. Even in the most controlled prison in America, danger lived in every shadow. The mind as a weapon. The guard's wound healed, but the tension in the unit never did. For the officers, every step past those cells carried the memory of that attack. For the inmates, it was proof. No matter how many cameras, chains, or steel doors, violence always found a way. But in ADX Florence, brute force wasn't the only weapon. The mind itself became a battlefield. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks dissolved into years. With no real contact, no real view of the world, some prisoners began talking to voices that weren't there. Others refused to leave their bunks, staring at the ceiling for hours, whispering to themselves. The silence was crushing, but it was also designed. The architects of ADX believed if you controlled a man's mind, you controlled everything. And it worked. Letters that left the prison were checked, censored, and often delayed for months. Phone calls were rare, monitored, timed, and cut off at the smallest hint of anger. Families often said it felt like their loved ones had vanished. But one inmate found a way to remind the world he was still alive. Late one night, guards discovered a cell wall smeared with words written in blood. The prisoner had cut into his own arm, using his body as ink to scrawl a message. "I am still here." That image spread through the unit like wildfire. A cry from the dark. A reminder that even in the prison where men disappear, some will do anything to be seen. The routine of vanishing. The words smeared in blood, "I am still here," were quickly scrubbed off the wall. The cell was cleaned, the prisoner taken away, and life at ADX Florence returned to its brutal routine. For the men trapped inside, days looked almost identical. Breakfast slid through the slot. Hours of pacing in tight circles inside the cell. Reading the same books over and over, if you were lucky enough to get one. Silence, broken only by distant clanks of steel. This wasn't chaos like other prisons. No gangs running the tier. No shouting matches in the yard. Just nothing. And that's what made it so dangerous. One former warden called ADX Florence a cleaner version of hell. He knew it wasn't the noise that destroyed men, it was the emptiness. But silence doesn't always keep violence away. During a routine escort, an inmate suddenly lunged at another prisoner while shackled. In just seconds, he had his hands around the man's throat. Even chained, he squeezed hard enough to leave deep bruises. Guards rushed in, tackling him to the ground, alarms blaring through the corridor. The victim gasped for air as officers dragged the attacker back to his cell. And the entire block was left with the same thought. If men can turn this violent while chained, what happens when the silence finally drives them past the point of no return? Voices in the dark. After the strangling incident, the prison locked down even tighter. Movement was slowed, escorts doubled, and every guard was reminded, never look away, not even for a second. But inside those cells, the quiet routine carried on. Meals. Silence. Pacing in circles. Over and over again. For some men, the silence became unbearable. They began to create their own world. Some talked to the walls as if someone was listening. Others made imaginary friends out of shadows. Guards often said they could hear whispers at night, soft conversations, but only one voice in the cell. It was as if the prisoners were speaking to ghosts. The prison staff knew what was happening. ADX Florence was eating away at their minds. Slowly, quietly. But one night, that silence broke in a way no one expected. A correctional officer making his rounds found a prisoner sitting on the floor, his wrists shredded open. But this time, there was no message on the wall. Just pools of blood soaking into the concrete. Alarms rang. Medics rushed in. They saved his life, but barely. And when the door slammed shut behind him, every other inmate was left with the same thought. If the walls don't kill you, your own mind will. A place with no escape. The suicide attempt shook the unit, but soon the silence returned. The endless cycle of meals through slots, pacing in circles, and staring at walls began again. At ADX Florence, the rules are simple. You live in your cell, you eat in your cell, and you sleep in your cell. The world outside shrinks until it feels like it no longer exists. Some prisoners said it was like being buried alive. Awake, breathing, but cut off from everything. Every inmate thinks about escape at least once. But ADX was designed to make that impossible. The walls are reinforced concrete. The fences are layered with motion sensors and razor wire. The doors are controlled electronically, one at a time. Even Al Chapo Guzman, the man who tunneled out of a Mexican prison, couldn't find a way here. He once ruled an empire of tunnels, soldiers, and cash, but at Florence, he's just another shadow locked away. But despite the iron grip, desperation always finds cracks. One day, an inmate refused to return to his cell after yard time. He dropped to the ground, screaming, clawing at the dirt like he was digging for freedom. Guards swarmed, shackled him, and dragged him back, kicking and spitting. The attempt was hopeless, but the message was clear. Some men would rather be beaten bloody than return to the silence of their cells. And that's when the rest of the unit realized, there is no escape. Not through tunnels, not through fences, not even through death. ADX Florence holds on tighter than anything else in America. Legends behind the walls. The inmate's failed attempt to claw his way out reminded everyone inside. Escape from ADX Florence is just a dream. The silence swallowed the prison once again. Days went back to the same routine. Locked cells, whispered prayers, and the distant sound of gates clanking shut. But behind those steel doors sat men whose names once dominated headlines. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. Terry Nichols, the Oklahoma City bomber. Jakar Sarnev, the Boston Marathon bomber. Each one, once feared across the nation, now reduced to a ghost locked in concrete. For the world outside, their stories had ended. But inside ADX, their punishment had only just begun. A former warden once said, "They will not see the sun set twice in the same place for the rest of their lives." It meant the men inside would never have a real horizon, never have a real sky. Just the same walls, forever. But then came another breaking point. One prisoner, enraged after years of silence, tore apart his mattress. Hidden inside was a sharpened piece of metal, smuggled, carved, no one knew how it got there. He hurled it at a guard during mealtime, the blade slicing through the air and narrowly missing its target. Within seconds, the block erupted with alarms. Guards stormed the corridor, shields raised, dragging the inmate out in chains. The attack was short, but the message was eternal. Even in a place designed to erase you, some men fight to remind the world they still exist. The prison that swallows time. After the blade incident, the prison went into full lockdown. Doors stayed sealed for days. Meals were delivered faster, guards moved in pairs, and every sound of boots echoed louder in the empty halls. Then, slowly, life slipped back into its cold rhythm. Silence returned. In ADX Florence, time didn't move the way it did outside. Days stretched like rubber bands, blending into months, then years. Some inmates forgot birthdays, lost track of seasons, and even confused dreams with reality. One prisoner wrote in a letter, "I no longer know if I am living a day or a decade." And the staff knew it too. ADX wasn't just a prison. It was a machine built to erase men from the inside out. But not everyone faded quietly. One night, the silence was broken by the sound of fire. A prisoner had managed to set his bedding ablaze, smoke curling through the vents, alarms shrieking as guards rushed in. The fire was small, but in a place of pure concrete and silence, the sight of flames was shocking, a reminder that even here, men would burn their own world just to feel alive. When the smoke cleared, the cells went quiet again. But every inmate lay awake, staring at the walls, thinking the same thought. ADX Florence doesn't just take your freedom. It takes your time, your mind, and sometimes your will to live. The prison of no return. The smoke from the fire had barely cleared before ADX locked down again. 4 days, guards moved with heavy shields, checking every cell, searching for anything that could spark rebellion. Then, as always, silence returned. Back in their cells, the men settled into the endless cycle. Food through the slot. An hour in a concrete cage. Back to pacing circles inside 4 walls. It was routine, but it was also punishment. Many inmates began refusing their meals, pushing the trays back untouched. For some, it was protest. For others, it was the only thing left they could control. The outside world rarely noticed. Families who wrote letters said weeks or months passed without replies. Phone calls were scarce. Appeals dragged on endlessly. For most of the men inside, ADX Florence was not just prison, it was the end of the road. And then came another shocking moment. During a transfer from one unit to another, a high-profile inmate spat directly in the face of a guard. What followed was chaos, sirens, shouting, shields slamming. The inmate was slammed to the ground, shackled, and dragged across the floor as other prisoners banged on their doors, the sound echoing like a drumbeat through the block. It was a short burst of violence, but it reminded everyone of a chilling truth. Inside ADX Florence, even the smallest act of defiance explodes like a bomb. Broken bodies, broken spirits. The echoes of steel doors slamming after the spitting incident lingered in the minds of everyone inside. For days, the prison moved slower, tighter. Guards wore their shields heavier, and inmates felt the pressure of the invisible grip that never loosened. Then, as always, silence returned. Inside the cells, the toll on bodies and minds grew worse. Some inmates stopped exercising altogether, their muscles wasting away from years of inactivity. Others paced obsessively, walking thousands of steps in a space barely larger than a bathroom. Psychologists who studied ADX called it clean torture. There were no beatings, no riots, no chaos. But the endless solitude ate away at the human spirit. One prisoner wrote in a letter, "It is like being buried alive, except you keep waking up." But even in the quietest place in America, violence still seeped through the cracks. During an escort, an inmate suddenly headbutted a guard, breaking his nose in an explosion of blood. The hallway lit up with sirens as officers swarmed, tackling the prisoner to the ground. Blood pooled across the tiles, and shouts filled the silence that had ruled for so long. In just seconds, the calm of the unit was gone, replaced by chaos, pain, and rage. And when the doors slammed shut again, the message was clear: ADX Florence doesn't just hold criminals. It creates pressure until men explode. When silence becomes a weapon. The guard's broken nose was patched, the inmate dragged away in chains, and ADX fell back into its heavy silence. 4 days afterward, officers patrolled with more caution, eyes sharper, radios crackling with tension. But eventually, the rhythm of the prison returned. Back in their cells, men sank deeper into isolation. Some whispered prayers. Others scratched tally marks into the concrete, carving years into stone. For many, those marks were the only proof time was still moving. It was a strange kind of warfare, silence against the human mind. And silence was winning. One prisoner wrote that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the walls, louder than any sound in the block. Another claimed he started hearing voices, only to realize it was his own mind playing tricks. But even when the silence smothered them, desperation pushed back. In one shocking event, a prisoner managed to smash the shatterproof glass covering his light fixture. With the jagged edge in his hand, he slashed violently at his own arms as guards rushed in. Blood sprayed across the white concrete as officers wrestled the weapon away. He survived, but the scars ran deeper than his skin. That night, the other inmates lay awake, staring at their ceilings, realizing the truth. At ADX Florence, silence isn't just punishment. It's a weapon, and it cuts deeper than steel. The prison of shadows. The echoes of that night, the glass shattering, the screams, the rush of boots, lingered long after the blood was cleaned. But in ADX Florence, nothing ever truly changes. The walls swallowed the chaos, and silence ruled again. Back in their cells, prisoners sank into their routines. Some counted cracks in the ceiling. Others replayed old memories in their minds, holding on to pieces of the outside world that were slipping further away. The prison was so quiet that inmates learned to listen through the air vents. They tapped, whispered, even sang faintly into the steel grates, just to remind themselves they weren't alone. Those stolen moments of connection were like oxygen. But ADX Florence was built to crush even that. Guards often cut off vent communication, tightening control until the prisoners had nothing but their own voices left. And that's when the darkness crept in again. One inmate pushed past his breaking point, tore open his own veins, and used his blood to paint strange symbols across the walls of his cell. The symbols didn't make sense: spirals, jagged lines, and words that seemed half-finished. By the time officers arrived, he was unconscious, sprawled across the floor, his artwork still glistening on the concrete. He survived, but the sight of those blood-soaked symbols spread fear through the unit. Because inside ADX Florence, men weren't just disappearing from the outside world, they were beginning to disappear from themselves. The edge of sanity. The strange symbols scrawled in blood were painted over, but the image never left the minds of the men who saw them. 4 days, whispers traveled through the vents, each inmate wondering what the symbols meant. Were they messages, warnings, or the final thoughts of a breaking mind? But in ADX Florence, there was no time to dwell. Silence quickly swallowed the fear, and the rhythm returned. 3 meals through a slot. Hours of pacing. A single sliver of sky during recreation. The world outside kept moving. Families aged, cities changed, wars began and ended, but inside, time froze. Men measured their lives not in years, but in echoes and footsteps. Some tried to cope. They wrote letters to no one. They drew on scraps of paper. They whispered prayers, hoping God could reach through concrete. But ADX Florence doesn't forgive. And it never forgets. In one terrifying moment, a guard passing by a cell noticed something unusual, silence so complete it felt heavier than normal. When he peered inside, he saw the inmate hanging from a torn bedsheet tied to the bars. Alarms erupted. Medics ran in. But it was too late. The prisoner had taken the only escape ADX allows. The death shook the entire block. Because in that moment, every inmate realized the truth. Inside ADX Florence, your body might last a lifetime, but your soul is always looking for a way out. The living tombs. The suicide rattled the prison. For weeks, the guards moved slower, more alert, their eyes scanning every shadow. The inmates fell quieter, each one reminded that death was the only true exit from ADX Florence. But as always, the walls swallowed the noise. Life, or what passed for it, slipped back into routine. Inmates sat alone in their cells, meals arriving like clockwork. Hours stretched endlessly, broken only by the buzz of fluorescent lights and the sound of steel sliding shut. The prison wasn't built for rehabilitation. It wasn't built for hope. It was built to bury men alive in silence. One former warden once called the cells living tombs. And he wasn't wrong. But even tombs can't hold back desperation forever. One afternoon, guards opening a food slot were met with a flash of movement. An inmate hurled a cup of boiling water, mixed with his own feces, into the officer's face. The guard screamed in agony as alarms rang out. Officers in riot gear swarmed the block, dragging the prisoner down while the others pounded on their doors, their voices filling the silence with raw chaos. The attack was brutal, but it wasn't random. In a place where prisoners had almost nothing left, violence became the last language they could still speak. That day, every inmate and every guard was reminded, ADX Florence doesn't just erase men. It pushes them to the very edge, where survival means turning rage into a weapon. The cost of control. The guard burned by boiling water was rushed to the infirmary. 4 days, the smell of disinfectant and scorched fabric clung to the corridors. Officers doubled their shields, their eyes sharper, their movements slower. And yet, as always, ADX swallowed the chaos. The block slipped back into silence. Meals slid through slots. Doors clanked shut. Inmates stared at their concrete walls, carving time into stone. Some wrote letters they knew might never leave the prison. Others counted steps until their minds went numb. The silence was heavy, but it was also the point. ADX Florence was designed to be unbreakable, to strip away everything that made a person feel human. But even concrete cracks under enough pressure. One night, an officer making rounds stopped dead in his tracks. From inside a cell came a low, strange humming. It grew louder, turning into a scream that didn't stop. The prisoner had shredded his mattress, stuffed pieces into his mouth, and pressed himself against the bars, howling until his throat tore raw. By the time the guards pulled him out, he was trembling, eyes wide, staring at something that wasn't even there. The other inmates heard every sound. And when silence finally returned, one truth settled heavy over the block. Inside ADX Florence, control isn't just about walls and steel. It's about breaking the mind until nothing is left to fight. Ghosts of the outside world. The echoes of that night, the howling, the tearing, the madness, stayed with every man on the block. But like all things in ADX Florence, the sound was eventually swallowed by silence. Back to routine. Back to pacing in tight circles. Back to staring at slit windows that showed nothing but a piece of sky. For the men locked inside, the outside world began to feel like a dream. Children grew up without them. Cities changed. Wars ended. But in ADX, time was a flat circle, unmoving, endless. Some tried to hold on. They replayed old memories like broken tapes in their heads. The sound of a mother's voice. The smell of a city street. The laughter of their children. But the longer they stayed inside, the more those memories faded, until only fragments were left. And then came another extreme event that cut through the silence. During a rare medical visit, an inmate suddenly snapped. With no weapon in hand, he lunged at the nurse, sinking his teeth into her arm. Blood poured as guards wrestled him down, sirens shrieking through the corridors. The attack was savage, primal, proof that after years in the tombs of ADX, some men didn't just lose their sanity. They lost their humanity. That day, guards whispered among themselves, ADX doesn't just disappear criminals. It turns men into ghosts who sometimes come back to bite. The price of disappearing. The nurse attack sent shockwaves through the prison. Staff whispered about it for days, their voices low, their eyes sharper when they walked the blocks. But ADX Florence is built to absorb chaos. The blood was cleaned, reports filed, and silence fell again. Inmates returned to their tomb-like cells. Meals through a slot. An hour in a cage. Lights buzzing overhead. The routine never changed. For some, the silence was punishment enough. They withered away, bones pressing against skin, voices fading into whispers. For others, the silence became fuel. They turned inward, plotting, waiting, biding time, even when time itself seemed endless. A former guard once said, "You don't just disappear criminals here. You disappear the world from them. And when you do that long enough, something inside either breaks or mutates." And then came the next breaking point. During an escort, an inmate suddenly collapsed. The guards thought he had fainted. But when they bent down to check, he sprang up with a sharpened shard of plastic hidden in his sleeve. He slashed wildly, cutting into one officer's vest before being swarmed to the ground. The attack failed, but the message was clear. Even in a prison designed to erase men, desperation finds ways to fight back. That night, the silence returned heavier than ever. Every prisoner knew the truth. In ADX Florence, men don't just disappear. They become something unrecognizable, caught between survival and madness. Buried alive in concrete. The failed ambush left one officer bleeding and every guard on edge. Chains clinked louder, boots hit the floor harder, and shields felt heavier in their hands. But like every storm in ADX Florence, it passed. The noise faded. The walls absorbed it. Silence ruled again. Inside the cells, life, or what passed for it, went on. 3 meals. 1 hour in a concrete cage. 23 hours staring at the same 4 walls. Some inmates began to break in quieter ways. They stopped speaking. They stopped eating. They stopped moving, curling into their bunks as if willing the world to forget them. Others scratched words into the walls, leaving messages only they could understand: still here, not gone, alive. But ADX Florence is not a place that listens. It's a place that buries. And then came a chilling reminder of just how far men could fall. During a nightly check, guards opened the slot of a cell and were hit with a foul stench. Inside, the inmate sat naked, smeared in his own filth, rocking back and forth, eyes vacant. He had stopped eating, stopped washing, stopped caring. The officers dragged him out, their gloves slick, their faces grim. And as they locked the door again, the truth echoed through the block. ADX Florence doesn't just punish the body. It buries the mind alive until there's nothing left to save. The prison that erases men. The inmate dragged from his own filth was only one of many broken by ADX Florence. The silence swallowed him, just like it swallowed so many before. And yet, the cycle went on. 3 meals a day. 1 hour in a cage. 23 hours in a tomb. Some men screamed. Some whispered. Some tried to fight back. Others simply faded into shadows of who they once were. ADX Florence was never meant to rehabilitate. It wasn't built to heal. It was built to disappear men so dangerous, so notorious, that society wanted them forgotten forever. But in doing so, the prison became something even darker. It became a place where time doesn't move, where minds rot in silence, where the worst criminals in America vanish, not because their lives end, but because their humanity is stripped away, piece by piece, until nothing is left. The Alcatraz of the Rockies. ADX Florence is called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, but even Alcatraz was just a prison. This place is something else entirely. It is America's prison of no return. A concrete machine that swallows criminals and erases their existence, turning living men into ghosts. The world outside may forget them, but inside those walls, silence never forgets. And that leaves us with one haunting question. If disappearing a man is worse than killing him, what does that say about the place we call justice?